Les rendez-vous de l'infra, le podcast d'Infravenir qui parle des infrastructures à travers des tables rondes et des interviews exclusives.
Mobilité,
énergie,
défis climatiques,
infrastructure sociale.
Toutes vos questions trouveront des réponses. Bonne écoute.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Hannah from Infravenir, and we are very much happy to see all of you here to talk about one of the most interesting, if not fascinating, subjects in the energy world at the moment, which are negative electricity prices. Just for your information, this particular conference is also part of our international series, wherein we try to host events in English in order to tap into a broader range of infrastructure professionals. Okay, so before we delve into the discussion with our speakers this evening, considering how complex the topic is of negative electricity prices, we thought it made sense to give you a context so that we all would have a fair understanding before we really go into the depth of the subject. So to start off, maybe a good way to look at things is from the infrastructure sectors. When we think about infra assets, the first in mind has always been essential assets that have long-term sustainable cash flow. So that's your textbook definition of what an infrastructure asset is. And by virtue of this cash flow generation that is stable and visible over the long term, we have always the sector has always been considered as a sector that is safe, low volatility, and to a certain extent, quote unquote, boring. But of course, we don't believe that in Infravenir. But as you've seen in the recent years with the development of sectors due to decarbonization, the increasing number of mid-sized infrastructure assets due to the decentralization of energy production and the increasing sophistication of investors, what we've seen is also the parallel development of risk-taking. And because of that, what we have seen is basically more and more assets that we are considering as infrastructure that are not anymore producing the same kind of cash flow visibility or stability that we have seen in the past with road PPPs or even airports. And that is very, very much obvious in the energy world and the electricity world. As you've seen in the last 2 years, we've seen prices go up, which really pushed or motivated, emboldened a lot of investors and IPPs to just go and expose themselves into the market. The thing with market exposure is you're not only exposed to the high prices, you're also exposed to the low prices. And recently, what we've seen is that you could also be exposed to below zero or negative electricity prices.
Thank you, Anna. Indeed, in recent years, European energy markets have experienced a widespread crisis characterized by high price volatility and a sharp rise of wholesale market prices. From 2021, energy market prices have been severely disrupted, and the Russian-Ukrainian conflict has intensified the crisis because of the risk of the Russian gas supply interruption. The crisis had also an impact on the price of electricity, which is indexed to the value of gas. The crisis has led Europe to question the way markets operate, and a reform of the market design was adopted in 2024. In this troubled market environment, still ongoing, we have gradually seen an increase of the phenomenon of negative prices. In all day-ahead and intraday markets, electricity prices can fall below zero, as Anna said. This phenomenon is certainly not new, but it is becoming increasingly frequent due to the significant growth of renewable energies. For example, in France, before COVID, the number of hours with negative electricity prices never reached 20 or so. But in 2023, it exceeded 100 hours and has reached record levels since the beginning of 2024, around 300 if I'm not mistaken. Negative prices phenomenon occurs indeed when the production of renewable energy and inflexible energy sources is high and the consumption level is low. According to the merit order logic, the various power units are called up progressively according to their marginal costs. Therefore, the first power units to be called up are those producing so-called fatal electricity, which is lost if it's not used at a given moment, as the renewable electricity, for example. Therefore, when renewable production exceeds consumption, controllable units would have to shut down that production. However, inflexible energy sources, such as nuclear power units, for example, cannot be shut down and restarted. It may be more advantageous for a producer, to put it simply, to pay to continue to produce rather than to shut it down the unit. To better understand how to explain this phenomenon, how it is addressed and how its practical consequences, we will be talking with 4 speakers tonight who have agreed to answer our questions and discuss their views. Thank you to them. We will let you introduce yourself. Please, Pierre.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I'm Pierre. I'm the country head for France at Aura Energy Research. We are a market modeling company, so basically we model the evolution of electricity prices in the long term, and this is used by developers to get their projects financed.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Philippe Garel. I work for Siena. So Siena is an investment manager company. It's 300 employee. Our asset under management is 40 billion euro. I'm the head of the energy transition team. And so what we provide is, I would say, a junior debt, junior infra debt, as Anna mentioned, to finance energy transition. And so today I am not the biggest specialist of energy prices, but I will represent, I would say, the sides of investors.
Thank you, Philippe.
Yes, good evening. I'm Gérard Vignal from RTE, which is the French TSO. Well, the French TSO maintains the infrastructure, the pylons and the line, but that's not why I'm here today. We have 2 other missions, which has, first one, we operate the system. That is to say, we have to balance every second production and consumption. And the third mission we have, we propose market rules to regulator. And these market rules, it's the rules for BRP, the balancing responsible party, because all the BRP should be balanced. So we have some market rules for that. And of course, it has an impact on the whole market, because if you are not balanced, you pay some penalties. And of course, in fact, it has an impact on the market, because at the end of the day, in fact, on the energy market, even on the spot market, in fact, you do not really exchange energy. In fact, you exchange unbalance. That's what is exchanged. And the real energy, it's only the real time. So it's very important for the functioning of the market. We also operate the very short-term market, which is the balancing market. And I will say a few words on the impact of negative prices on this market and how we manage these negative prices. We also propose rules for demand response. I mentioned this because it's maybe I'm too long for the introduction. I'm sorry. I will skip my place later, because yes, the rules for demand response, it's very important because it's a source of flexibility. So a way to solve these negative prices is to increase the consumption. So RTE is in charge of proposing these rules. And last, but it's not really, I mentioned it, but it's not really, we are not really concerned, it's on the capacity market. Because no, we propose rules for capacity market, but honestly, all these issues on negative prices are not taken into account directly in the capacity market. Maybe, but I'm not sure. Maybe in the future we will have negative prices for the capacity market, but we have time.
Good evening. So I'm representing Pexapark tonight. Good evening. So yeah, Pexapark is actually an advisor for PPA, so Power Purchase Agreement, which is a private law contract to exchange electricity between buyers and sellers. We are based in Zurich and active in the entire European continent.
Thank you. So my first question is for you, Gérald. Could you please elaborate what is a negative electricity price? And could you explain what are the factors contributing to its occurrence? For example, is the phenomenon of negative prices linked to the principle of merit order, as I mentioned in introduction?
Yes, thank you. Well, first, I would like to come back a few, I'm sorry, because you are all young professionals, so sorry, but I would like to come back a few years before. It was after the extinction of dinosaurs. But there was no market, it was the monopoly. So it's interesting to have this in mind, because inside the monopoly, in fact, you have what we call a unit commitment optimization. That is to say, we use to optimize the different assets to meet demand. And we calculated a marginal cost every hour, I would say, we use to calculate a marginal cost. And of course, in a well-functioning market, the marginal cost of the system is equal to the price. But let's come back to the monopoly. And at that time, so in some time step, these marginal costs, they were negative. There were no renewable at that time, only runoff hydro. And yet, we used to have a negative marginal cost. So why? The fact it was linked to the fact that some traditional thermal unit, coal unit, and of course nuclear unit, had some constraints, and also they had some startup cost. That is to say, if you shut down a unit and then you start up the unit, you have to pay a cost. Okay, it's a startup cost. And the consequence of that is the fact if you shut down a unit and then you start up a unit, it costs. So in avoid to balance the system, you need to send a signal which is negative, the marginal cost is negative, otherwise you never stop some thermal unit because of these constraints and because of this startup cost. So I just wanted to mention this because sometimes we hear a lot of things about negative prices, and negative prices are sometimes they are always linked to renewable, but it's not always the case. In fact, even in a system in which there are no renewables, only runoff hydro, in fact, you can have negative prices. So it was the first point. It's really linked to the constraints of the different units. And in France, of course, we have these constraints on the nuclear plants, which are very, very important, and also these startup costs, because it's not a linear programming. It's a mixed linear problem, and due to the startup cost, we can have negative marginal costs and then negative prices. So it used to be the case, but in fact we had very few negative prices during the first years of the functioning of the market for two reasons. First, due to European optimization, because of course we have these constraints on the nuclear in France, but thanks to the interconnection, you can of course export energy when there is a supply of energy in France, and so it helped to reduce this occurrence of negative prices. That's the first reason. And there also a second reason, which is not always mentioned, is the fact that the traditional players, they refuse at that time to bid to negative prices. So in fact, there were no bid at negative prices. So come today, so we have this issue. And we have, of course, a second issue, which is the huge proliferation of renewables. And we have different types of contracts. We have some historical contracts, which are feed-in tariff, so very, very basic contracts. And we have all these contracts, market plus premium. And the way these contracts are designed is quite different between the different European countries. In France, you, as a producer, you get the premium only if the prices are positive. So if you are a rational player, and if you have all the IT to monitor your plants, you should stop the production of your unit when prices become negative, because that's clear, you lose the premium. It's not the case in all the European countries, and especially in Germany, they use and they still have a lot of contracts in which you get the premium even if the prices are negative. So there is a cap for this premium, and as a producer, if you are a rational producer, you stop producing when the prices become below minus this cap. So that's the reason why we see huge negative prices, for instance, in Germany, but we have the same issue in other countries. Things are changing. I mean, the market rules are changing, but we still have a lot of historical contracts. So we have these, and in Germany, they still have a lot of lignite coal power plant, and these, as nuclear plants, these plants have a lot of constraints, and they have this startup cost issue. So if you look at I'm sure you are familiar with Economics, the app developed by RT. If you looked at Economics at the European level, or the transparency platform, you can see that even if when you have negative prices, in fact, the production of the coal power plant, the German coal power plant, remain stable. In fact, they do not reduce their production. So it's another constraint and inflexibility in the system. So when you had the proliferation and the high development of renewable, you had all the different constraints we have in the system. The result is negative prices. So in theory, we shouldn't have negative prices if all the market rules were designed as the current French market rules. But there are some assumptions. The first is the fact that all the power plants are monitored and the producers react to negative prices. So it's a big assumption because we have some quite old wind farm or PV panel that are not monitored. It's the first point. And the second is the fact we should have rational player. I mean player that optimize their portfolio. It seems very obvious, but if we look at precisely what is happening during negative prices, we can see that, well, the rationality, the theoretical rationality is not always there. For instance, in France, we see some producer that stops producing 2 hours before negative prices, or they continue to stop producing during 3 or 4 hours after negative prices. So some adjustments are probably necessary. So it's a learning curve. It will take time, but at the end, we will have we could fix this problem. Nevertheless, we still have a major problem, which is the fact that even if we curtail all the renewable that can be curtailed in, I will say, in 2035, for instance, we will have during, for instance, during the summer period and the afternoon in the summer period, we will have too much energy. We made a little study in RTE, for instance. It was not summer. It was in a weekend of May or June. Yeah, June, Pentecote. It's June or May, I don't know. It's just to give you a figure. So imagine that we can curtail, and we are in 2035. Imagine we can curtail all the wind farm, offshore and onshore wind farm, and we can curtail all the PV farm. I mean the big installation of PV. So we only have PV on a rooftop. Okay. So we curtail everything. We stop, of course, all the hydro. We use all the pump station, and we reduce. Of course, we have no coal in France as the horizon, and we reduce all the nuclear plant we can reduce. And with all these assumptions, we still have a surplus of energy of 15 gigawatt. So we have to find 15 gigawatt, and we have two options. Either we curtail some PV, but it's a huge challenge because we are speaking about residential PV on rooftop, and of course, these installations are not monitored, and it's impossible at that time to curtail this PV. Or the second option is to boost consumption during this period. So to have a huge shift of consumption between peak period and period of solar production. Yes, what is the role of a TSO? Well, maybe come back.
We could maybe speak about that maybe a bit later, but it could be interesting to share the chart that you mentioned maybe after for our audience.
Yes.
Maybe just to add on this, that was a very complete explanation. We also did an analysis this year. We looked, so as you said, there have been about 300 hours of negative prices in France since January until end of August. And what we wanted to understand at first was, are those negative prices imported or are they created in France? And I mean, this is debatable, but the way we looked at it is basically if the negative price hours occur when we are importing from Germany or the Benelux, and in that same hour, the prices are more negative in those countries than in France, we consider that this is an imported negative price. And the interesting thing we saw is that about 60% of the time we are importing those negative prices, and 40% of the time that's not the case. So that means either the prices are not negative in our neighbors, or they are less negative than in France. The other learning that we didn't expect is basically when the negative hours are imported, this is usually when the prices are more negative. So they tend to be below -€1. But for the 40% that are created in France, they tend to be very slightly negative. So -0.1 and down to -€1. And I think so to add to what was just said, there are inflexibility, of course, is a primary reason, as well as how the contracts for renewables are made in Germany, but also the Netherlands. But there is also something that contributes to negative prices, which is the bidding behavior of players in France. And Gérald slightly mentioned it, but some players in France do not curtail when prices or when they should be curtailing, and some renewables are even making negative bids in the market. And the reason for that is we estimate that about 30% of the wind farms in France are not equipped to curtail, so that you cannot remotely control them. And so if I am the owner of that wind farm, I'd rather be in the merit order and lose €0.1 per megawatt hour than be out of the merit order because I've bid zero and and the clearing price is below zero, and then I have to pay imbalance costs because I'm producing and I shouldn't be producing. So that is another reason why we see a significant increase of negative prices this year in France. And then another factor that contributes to that is just guarantees of origin, even though it doesn't concern a lot of assets, because in France we have mostly CFDs and feed-in tariffs. Some assets are under PPA or under merchant model, and in this case, well, you could be willing to bid down to minus what you expect to get from selling your guarantee of origin. So that was just to complement.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Pierre.
Yeah, thank you. That was a very comprehensive A to Z of what the negative price is. So, Pierre, I'm staying with you. What are the compensation mechanisms in place, and how effective are these in covering the losses for producers and to a certain extent to investors?
Okay. Well, I'm going to comment on onshore wind and solar PV. I think, and also depends on which tariff you got at what time. So the rules may have changed a bit, but what we have currently for onshore wind. So for the first 20 hours of negative prices, you are not compensated for this loss. So you don't receive your CFD payment. And then after 20 hours, for every hour after 20, you will get a compensation that is equal to your capacity multiplied by 35%, multiplied by your strike price. For solar, it's after 15 hours, and you get 50% multiplied by your capacity, multiplied by the strike price. And so what we see historically, that compensation tended to be more positive than the loss for solar assets, because it's 50% based on 50% of your capacity, but sometimes the negative price happens when you wouldn't even have produced, or you would have had a load factor that is below 50%. And negative prices also happen during wind production hours. So for solar, it was more of a positive contribution, and for wind, it's the other way around. Now, I think we may see that evolve in the future, just because of the faster growth of solar PV, which means that we should see negative prices hours happening more during the solar hours. So when the load factors of solar are closer to, or above 50%. And in that case, that becomes, the compensation is not enough to cover your loss.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And now, so if we take a step back and just look at the European context, when did negative electricity prices or the increased occurrence really happen in Europe, and what's the development of the frequency of these events?
So as you said, we had negative prices in 2019, but they were quite low. I think if I remember well, we really started a lot of negative prices in 2020. One reason was the COVID period, and the COVID also happened during the season when negative prices tend to happen, which is in spring. So that's when you have a lot of solar, you have a lot of run of hydro because it's the end of the winter, and you have a lot of wind. And basically it has been growing since then, with the exception of 2022, just because prices were super high in 2022, and we had limited hydro production and limited nuclear production in 2022. But after that, 2023 was a record year. 2024 is already a record year. I think, I'm not exactly sure about the figure, but we're more than 100% above what we saw last year in terms of number of occurrences.
Thank you. And I'm staying with you, Pierre, but the question is for all of you. What do you think will be the impact of negative prices on renewable energy support schemes for the future, and the evolution of the support schemes?
Well, I think what we're likely to see is that the regulator is going to look to make some changes to the support mechanisms. What we are talking about at the moment, there are several things. One is to include for the feed-in tariffs. So currently in France, we have feed-in tariffs for solar that is less than 500 kilowatts. So to introduce the fact that they should not be remunerated when the prices are negative, just like CFD. That's one option. There's also discussion of having a feed-in tariff where the price of the feed-in tariff varies depending on the time of day. So a kilowatt hour that you produce at, let's say, 9 a.m. would be worth a lot more than what you produce at midday, or we could even decide that we don't remunerate you for what you produce at midday. I think there may be others that I'm not thinking about.
Do you want to react? Or not? Gérald.
Well,
you seem to want to react.
That's clear. I just wanted to mention one point on regulation, which is linked to the balancing market, because something should evolve on the balancing market. Because, for instance, we face two major problems. the first problem we face is the fact that many renewable are not obliged to bid on the balancing market. That is to say, we cannot we cannot curtail these renewable on the balancing market, even if they have a zero marginal cost. So in most cases, we should rationally, economically call these units, but we do not, because they are not obliged to bid to the balancing market. So it's a first issue that should be tackled by the regulator. It's because all the units, you know, you're many lawyers in the room, so you know that all the units are obliged, the centralized unit are obliged to bid to the balancing market. It's in the energy code. We should have a kind of obligation for renewable of that type. It's the first issue. But there is also a second issue, is to curtail the curtailment. Because in many periods in which we have negative prices, we have a huge amount of curtailment, but during the real time, because of the forecast for the temperature, for instance, is different than the real temperature, or the renewable, the production of the remaining renewable are different of the production that was forecast. We should call a surplus or production. And in these cases, we call some thermal unit or hydro unit which have a certain marginal cost, which can be equal to 100 euro per megawatt hour or 200 euro. But at the same time, we have some renewable that have been curtailed, and the cost of these renewable is zero, because it's zero marginal cost. So it's also an issue. We should be able to curtail curtailment also on the balancing market. So from our perspective, two evolutions in the regulation are required. First, evolution, the obligation to propose curtailment on the balancing market. But second, the proposition, evolution, to propose to stop curtailment also on the balancing market. And it's a real issue. And I mean, it's not a little issue, but it's a major issue, because we can have some frequency problem because we lack these opportunity. So the consequences could be a deviation in frequency at the European level. And at the end, if we do not fix this problem, it's real curtailment. I mean, it's not curtailment of renewable, but curtailment of consumption to restore frequency. So this problem is we are at the beginning of this issue, because if you are familiar with the different warning we send, we have an app, another app. It's not Ecodemics, an app on which we send some warning for the players, and the warning is well, in French, marge à la baisse insuffisante. So it only means that we do not have enough production we can stop. And it's also a real issue, because, as I mentioned in my introduction, at every second, we must have this equilibrium between production and consumption. And we have a major problem, and the frequency represents this equilibrium. And we have a major problem if we do not have this equilibrium, and the issue is the same if we have a surplus or a deficit, a shortage of production.
If I may react to this and give a bit of a European perspective, because I realize we've mostly talked about France, what you're describing is something that we see in other European markets. So, for example, in Spain, now there are several renewable plants, be they solar PV or onshore wind, that participate on those balancing markets. So they do so notably when the prices tend to be close to zero. There are few negative prices in Spain, but there are prices going to zero. And basically what they can do in that case, rather than bid in the day-ahead market and gain zero, they can reserve their capacity. So they curtail their capacity, and then they are able to bid that capacity upwards and downwards on the ancillary services market. And going back to your initial question and also giving more of a European perspective, your question was on the support mechanisms and how they're evolving. I talked about France, maybe on Germany, because that's important. On Germany, so renewables can bid negatively, as explained before, but there is something called the X-hour rule, which is if you have currently 6 consecutive hours of negative prices, then you don't get your CFD payment after more than 6 hours. And what Germany is currently doing is they're reducing that X-hour rule. So they're going to 4 hours, and then 2 hours, and then 1 hour. And that should create incentives for the renewable assets to not bid in periods of negative prices. And in the Netherlands, it's another mechanism. It's a feed-in premium, SDE++, and this one has been phased out in 2022. So we do see significant reactions from the energy regulators to mitigate the negative prices.
Thank you to you both. It's really interesting.
Okay, so tangibly speaking, I'm turning to Antoine now. So PEXA Park has very close relations with European generators, energy producers. Could you give us an idea of first how the negative electricity prices are affecting these producers, and what are the strategies that they are putting in place to cope with this phenomenon?
Yes, so I think as you are all very much aware, well, electricity prices is very volatile. I think it's not a surprise. So essentially, power producers tend to are willing to hedge their production, and so there's essentially 2 possibilities to hedge the production. The first one is actually the subsidy schemes that we discussed already tonight. So it's a feed-in tariff, CFD. That's, well, there's a few possibilities in different countries in Europe. There's also private law contracts that are called PPA. So power purchase agreements are not very well developed in France, but exist more commonly in other countries in Europe. Essentially, those contracts are defining different clauses to allocate the risk between energy transaction between a producer and an off-taker, which is actually the buyer of the electricity. And so we are seeing, so it's private law. Everything is possible to be negotiated more or less in this contract. So that's extremely flexible. And what we are seeing is that also negative prices are becoming something important for the different persons who are negotiating the PPAs. As I mentioned, PPAs are actually how to allocate the risk between the different parties in this contract. And we see 3 different types of allocation. The first one is actually all the risk of negative prices is bear by the buyer. So essentially, no matter the price level environment, the buyer will purchase the power at a price that is determined, usually fixed in the PPA. The other extreme is actually all the negative price risk is supported by the seller, which means that if the negative prices, if there's a situation of negative prices, then there will be no settlement. But in this case, the producer is usually able to curtail the production, meaning stopping the production. We already mentioned that. And obviously, there's a third possibility, which is a little bit in between. So what we see happening in PPA contracts is something when, and it's a little bit aligned with what we can see in subsidy, you determine a certain number of hours during which you can be compensated, and above this level, then there's no compensation. You can also see some price threshold where you can be compensated, and below which you're not compensated. Usually that's zero, around zero. So that's actually how PPA are evolving. And actually, this is quite important to consider the different effects and assess the different risks that you can be exposed to. Because in case of curtailment, obviously there's no revenue for the wind farm or the solar farm that you are operating. And just to give you an idea, based on our assessment, since the beginning of the year, approximately 25% of the solar hour in Spain were negative or strictly negative. So if the risk allocation is not favorable for the asset that you're operating, it can be quite an issue for the revenue. And obviously, the allocation of the risk is important for the price that you are asking, and also because the producer we are working with are usually renewable developers, but also investment funds, and they need their PPA to be bankable. So for the moment, I think there's no consensus on the market on what negative price risk allocation is acceptable or not acceptable by the banks, but maybe we can discuss that a bit later, obviously. But essentially, that's also something that the developer need to take into account. So that was for PPA in general. For the PS produced type that are the most common, so the electrons that are generated wants to have generation, have remuneration. We can also see some new tradings approach to generate revenues, new PPA structures, for example, pairs nominated, where you schedule the production that you would like to put on the market and get remunerated for that nomination. And there's also, as Pierre mentioned, some traders that are active, I don't know, but at least are considering trading on ancillary markets, so the secondary or tertiary market, because they see a value of just turning off the assets during certain hours to generate revenue and give a bit of flexibility to the grid.
Okay, thank you very much, Antoine.
Philippe, could you explain to us how negative prices are affecting the investors, and how are you positioning your infra-debt portfolio given such market environment?
Yes, as you can see, the question is very difficult, and that's why we have a lot of experts when we make some financing, because that's just a topic which is I mean, every time it's every year there is a new topic, and so we try to see how we can manage this the financing of new assets. So I would say that at least there are different type of investors. You have the family office, and then you have the institutional investors. So regarding family office, there are more risk taker. So it could be a situation where there are many opportunities because they like to take risk, and maybe the more volatility there is, the more opportunities they will find. As far as we are concerned, Sienna is working with mainly pension fund and insurer, and so the question is a bit difficult to answer, because where do they come from? And Anna mentioned it at the beginning, but when we are speaking about infra, it's a certain level of risk, basically investment grade risk, and there are many regulations for pension fund and for insurer to make sure that they can invest in infra, they have low cost of capital because it can be qualified as infra. And the first step has happened with the energy transition because we had very centralized assets, then with new thermal plants, and then became much more distributed with energy transition. So there has been a long period of education for institutional investor to make them accept a new kind of risk, which is not investment grade anymore, but a bit riskier. So typically, for this PV and wind asset that are really, I would say, medium size or even a small size, financing was covered by banks, and there were not many places for institutional investors, so family office, pension fund, and insurer. And so we managed to push insurer and pension fund to take more risk and to accept kind of subordination on the financing of the assets. So they have accepted to not to be in their zone of comfort, investment grade, but in their zone of a new zone, I will say, which is what we call a crossover, and margin which is maybe 300 basis points above what could provide the investment grade asset. So there is some basics in finance is that you do not mix operational and financial risk. So when we had some of this feed-in tariff and CFD, so basically there was a high leverage to finance the project, and very low operational risk, low volatility of the production, and very high leverage. So that's what we, in Siena, that's where we come from with financing this kind of asset. So I will say that we have financed more or less maybe 400 million euro on this kind of asset, but with the subordination, it corresponds to almost 3 billion euro of capex. So it's a huge number of assets for PV and wind. And then started the development of PPA, especially abroad. So with the PPA, most of the time you have an exposure to the merchant risk. So we have, I will say that the operational risk which was much higher, but we are still convinced the investor that they could go on this kind of asset because there was no more this subordination of financing, and we could provide a good risk return because of this lack or this absence of subordination. So now we are in a new, I will say, in a new age. Is what are we going to explain to our investors? Because they are going to read in the newspaper that there are negative prices everywhere, and what can we tell them? And so, from our point of view, I think there will be a period where it will be very difficult to be exposed to this merchant price, because negative prices are a bit random. And what is very difficult for an investor is not to be able to assess the risk. It's not a question of is there many risk or not a risk at all. And the question is how we can assess this risk. And I will say that for Spain, for example, we have finance projects in full merchant risk, so we are fully exposed to the market with low leverage without any subordination. But the question is at which point is it reasonable? So I think that we need, of course, some advisors to help us to tell with simulation, etc. Okay, the LCOE or the minimum price that you will capture if you are full merchant will be at this level, in order for the investors and also for the fund management team to be able to go to its committee and to prove them that it's a risk that can be taken. And I think that if we remain in this kind of situation, there is really a strong effort to do from all the parties to make sure that we find all new PPA, all new model of simulation, because when we speak to the specialists of the forecast, it's normal that they are wrong, but I mean the spread between the reality and the estimation were really are very big, but that's quite normal because I think the model are okay, but you don't know if it's going to rain next year or not. So it has a big consequence on prices. So I think it's a common effort. Try to explain what are the worst case, or to find some new PPA where you are able to assess the risk. Because if we stay in this situation, and I look the number of projects that we received from Spain in the last months, it's just incredible because basically the market is stuck. I mean, nobody knows how. I mean, when you say that, okay, I can be exposed to the merchant price. I mean, okay, I can finance a project exposed to the merchant price. I mean, you are a kind of extraterrestrial. Because we don't know how to assess the risk, and so we cannot sell this strategy to an institutional investor. So maybe it will create a lot of opportunities for family office, but at that point, I think we just need to work together to see what can we set up to assess the risk.
Thank you, Philippe. Antoine, what do negative electricity prices mean to the end consumer? Could you explain maybe if the consumers are benefiting of negative prices, or, for example, through dynamic pricing systems, or maybe reimbursements or whatever?
Well, I think there's a little bit of pros and cons in this situation. Obviously, consumers are not invoiced at the hourly level, so even if they buy electricity at negative price, they don't get reimbursed, or they don't have negative invoice. It's more at a monthly level, so obviously everything is averaged out. And in the case of PPA off-taker, usually they cannot match exactly their consumption with a solar or a wind profile. As you can very much imagine, if you have an industrial plant, you need potentially to operate it at the night. Not a surprise, you cannot purchase solar electricity during the night. So the combination of both is actually not making, well, I think overall they are more benefiting from low price environments in general rather than negative price specifically. But I think it's also maybe a challenging situation for them. And it's challenging just in the sense that it's an ecosystem. So if the consumer are pushing too low for the prices, there's no development of new capability because it's simply not profitable. So for them who usually commit with ESG engagement over the long term to purchase renewable electricity at a certain level of their consumption, if they can't meet their objective, that's an issue. And for negative price in general, I mentioned a bit earlier that there's different possibilities within a PPA to allocate the risk, whether it's fully supported by the producer or the consumer. If it's fully supported by the producer, if the consumer are actually pushing for the producer to bear all the risk, then it might become an issue because there's no settlement in case of negative price. So the incentive for the producer will be to curtail all the production. And if there's no production, if there's no delivery of power, then there's no revenue. There's no electricity for the consumer, and there's also no GOs because if you don't produce, then you can't have the guarantees of origin. So that's actually interesting to notice that some of the, with some negotiation, the negative price threshold is actually below zero because it also covers the price of guarantees of origin, because actually the consumer wants to have the GO because they commit somewhere to purchase green electricity. And if they don't get the GOs from the PPA, then they need to buy it on the market. And that's another layer of volatility for them. I think it's a little bit something to be seen, but this will be also important, the GO point in the future, because now it's possible to compensate energy consumption with GO at not a particularly granular level. But in the past, if there's some matching that exists, for example, matching at hourly level the consumption and the supply, then it might be complicated if there's some curtailment. So there needs to be a balance between both. And just to give you an example, in the Delegated Act of the European Union, the hydrogen electrolyzer will have actually to match consumption with PPA at hourly level, except if the spot prices are below a certain level. If I'm not mistaken, I think it's 20 euro per megawatt hour, meaning that they need to prove at an hourly level that their supply is green, but the Delegated Act also took into account the fact that if prices are particularly low, then they can purchase the electricity on the market, and they don't need specifically to use green PPAs that are actually causing potentially the negative price with excess solar or excess wind.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so Gerald, I turn to you now. I suppose this topic is something that you've talked about with your European peers. Could you tell us how the European TSOs and network balancing players are working together to address this phenomenon of negative electricity prices?
First, in fact, it's negative prices. It's just the tip of the iceberg, because we will fix it. Come back later. But the real problem, it was mentioned by Antoine briefly, is the fact that we have a system. We use to have well-functioning markets for optimal dispatch. That is to say, to dispatch the different units at the European level. And it used to work quite well. Of course, it has some consequences. For instance, the convergence of prices. And you mentioned gas in your introduction. But it worked. The problem we have, it's the fact that in the future, we will have many assets with the same marginal cost, which is equal to zero. So how do you balance a system with prices when all the assets have the same marginal cost? It's just impossible. So what we could have, and what we see with the negative prices, is what we call a bang-bang effect. So if the prices is negative, we curtail all the production, and we have a shortage of production, so we have to call up some units. So we are at the beginning of this issue, and this issue will increase, and probably at the end we should, and at the European level, have a huge market reform, because this price decomposition to solve the short-term dispatch problem will not function anymore in the future. So it's, and I'll say that what we are seeing around negative prices, it's really, it's the tip of the iceberg. It's a part of the of the iceberg, a little part of the iceberg. The real issue behind is really the way we optimize the assets at the European level with assets with zero marginal cost everywhere. So the first point. So the second point. So we have two solutions to fix the problem. We have some regulatory solution you mentioned, and probably at short term it will solve the problem. We have also this question of flexibility, and the major tool is the new demand response code. Maybe you have heard about this. So at that time, so the code, there was a proposition by ENSOE and EU DSO. Acer made some new proposals, and there is an open consultation on this code, and then it will go to the Commission. And this code proposes a symmetric approach for demand response. That is, no, we have rules for reduction of consumption, but we do not have the symmetric rules for overconsumption. So this new demand response code will tackle this issue. So it will have, of course, an impact on the consumer, because at the end, it says that with this new code, if a consumer accepts to consume more during negative prices, it will be paid by these demand response product. So even if the retailers do not propose real-time tariffs, thanks to this new code, it will have the opportunity, for instance, with an aggregator, to be paid for consuming. So the idea, of course, is to have this adjustment with consumption, and it will also help to reduce the negative prices, because, of course, you will charge your EV during these prices. You will switch on the air conditioning, and well, all the devices you can pilot. You will activate them during negative prices period. So it will probably solve a part of the issue, but we have the big issue is how we optimize a system with zero marginal cost everywhere. So big issue. We have a second issue is the huge development of self-consumption, because in Germany the plan is to have 160 gigawatt of PV in self-consumption at the 2035 horizon. It's huge. The global plan is 350 gigawatt of PV at that horizon in Germany. And well, we, as French, we should be very conscious, because you know, the Germans, it's incredible, but they respect their plan. So maybe we will have this huge amount of PV. So, and if you are a self-consumer, you don't care about regulation. You don't care about negative prices, because you are a you consume what you produce. So it could be also a major issue for the system, because you can have all the regulation you want, you can have all the private contracts you want in PPA, but at the end you are a self-consumer, and you don't care about the prices, you don't care about the regulation. So that is to say that we will have to find flexibility in other parts of the system. So we have to keep in mind that currently we are seeing the huge development of cell consumption, and it's out of the market. In fact, it's completely out of the market. Now it's quite limited in France. It's not anymore the case in Germany, but it's growing. And the second point is the fact that not only we have PV development in self-consumption, but also we have the development of batteries. We consider in Germany that at this horizon, the 2035, roughly 80% of the self-consumption project will have batteries. So what is the consequence of that? Is the fact that you will be able to manage your battery and to optimize consumption, PV production, and your battery. And probably the impact will be a decrease of the spread prices between the afternoon and the evening peak. So you will have a reduction of this spread. And why is it a problem? Well, in summary, you will have a long period with zero prices, so from 10 to 6 p.m. And the spread could be quite limited. So in that environment, how do you ensure the profitability of the different assets? And I mean all the assets, not only the flexible assets, but also the base load assets, because many hours with zero prices and a limited spread. So it could be a huge issue. And of course, this issue, there is one solution, which is the implicit solution, which is in all the reports, is the reindustrialization of Europe. Is to say, all the TSOs, we make the assumption that the consumption will increase a lot. So we will have a huge surge of consumption in every country in Europe. So it's the case in France. You read the bilan prévisionnel we published, and you probably saw that we envisage a huge surge in the consumption, more than 200 terawatt-hour at the 2035 horizon. So under these conditions, of course, we can manage the issue I presented previously. But under these conditions, what if we do not have these conditions everywhere in Europe? So we will have probably a major issue, and we will have stranded assets probably everywhere. So I think we should keep in mind, and I'm sure that Aurora has very precise model to forecast the consumption, and we will all need this forecast and this model for the future. And the last point, yes, the last point, it's about interconnection, because it can be easy to accuse the other countries, and you mentioned it previously. What we saw in our studies on historical data, it's not forecast, is the fact that thanks to interconnections, we can reduce the period of negative prices in France, because we can export a few hours of the period of negative prices. So we see that we reduce in most of cases, not all the cases, but in many cases, we reduce the period of negative prices in France. I mean, we compare an optimization without interconnection and an optimization with interconnection. But during the remaining period in which we have negative prices, the prices are lower than in isolated system. So we reduce the period, but the negative prices are lower. So the consequences of interconnection are quite mixed on this issue of negative prices.
Okay, thank you very much. That's pretty comprehensive. So before we go into Q&A, we have just one last question, and this is for Philippe. So now looking forward, who do you think are the winners and losers of such an environment, and what are the consequences for Europe's energy transition program?
Thank you, Anna. So maybe what I could say is about the cost of capital. So at the end, energy transition is about investment. To succeed in energy transition, it's around 200 billion euro of investment per year. And when you finance an asset, depending on the predictability of cash flows, it will cost more or less 3% or 10%. So I think that this issue is key. I mean, to make sure that when we finance an asset, at least it's not for all the assets, but for each time we have a project to finance, can be for banks, for institutional investors. We have financial model, and we need to make sure that how is cash flow predictable. If it is not, it will cost 10%. If it is predictable, it will be half the price. So at the end, I think it's very important for everyone to make sure that we take time to find a good solution, the good model, to optimize the financing and find the best financing solution. So I guess that you will have very simple players that will just make a project fully exposed to the market, and these players, I mean, I don't think they will survive because their cost of capital will be too high. So maybe they will do 1, 2, 3 projects, but we see that in a few years, if you don't manage to handle this complexity, at the end you will not be able to demonstrate that your costs, your risk is low, and then you should not have access to the low rate financing. So I think it's very important for players to find a good way to have predictable cash flows, and it's with the management of the complexity. I guess it's a combination of portfolio, maybe around Europe, of technology, PV, wind, and storage, etc. So the winner will clearly be the one that are able to demonstrate that they are able to manage the complexity. Globally, if we don't manage to do that, we will not succeed in the carbon neutrality by 2050. And regarding the institutional investors, it's very important not to miss the step. If we look at what happened on the real estate, for example, in the last few years, you only have one part of the real estate that had very bad performance. But at the end, all the market has been stuck for 3 years. It starts It restarts again in 2024. I guess it will start in 2025. And I think that if we are not careful, and if we push too many assets with and if we do not sell the right risk to our investors, and if there are some problems on some portfolio, I guess the whole market will be a bit stuck for a while. So I think we always have been able to manage this complexity. So I guess we will manage to reindustrialize Europe. We'll manage to have a strong consumption and to manage all this complexity. And at the end, we will succeed it. But it's clearly a challenge.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Okay, so now we turn to our audience. Is there anyone who has any questions to any of our speakers?
And you will be able also to discuss with all of them with the drink just
Exactly. So either you
don't be afraid.
either you do it now or through the cocktails. But there you go.
So thank you everyone for your time and for this interesting discussion. Maybe I had a question regarding the pricing of this negative electricity prices. I'm looking at Antoine because you mentioned that you have different type of flexibilities in your PPAs. Can you give an indicative cost for the difference between the PPA where the buyer is willing to pay this extra risk below for buying electricity at a negative price, and the one where there's no flexibility?
I don't have figures to share with you. I would say, as a good consultant, it depends. It depends on the different type of allocation you have, but it also depends on the view you have of future realization of negative prices. Just to give you an example here, so we are not modeling the market. So when we would perform this kind of analysis, it would not be based on our data. But I'm currently working on a mandate in Spain, and the beginning of the year in Spain was absolutely terrible in terms of negative prices. You have that's a black swan event. You have a combination of high solar generation, but that's more or less as always. But you also have a lot of hydro generation during spring, and everything combined makes I don't remember exactly the number of negative hours. But now here we are, and what do we do with that? Do we consider this as a good forecast for the next 10 years? Because usually when you sign a PPA, that's based on 10 years, a bit more in France. Or do you consider that's actually a black swan? It won't reproduce in the future. It's really based on assumption, to be honest. And for the moment, unfortunately, I don't have specific answer to mention to you. But just maybe the consensus, at least for Spain, is that it's more the black swan option rather than something that would repeat in the future.
Thank you. My question is maybe more for Gerald. You said that producers are not always rational, that some of them continue to produce even with the negative price and so on. I was wondering if it's more a question of rationality or a question of feasibility. Do they have enough information? Do you know if at the level of all of the producers, do they have the means to manage this, or not at all? Or is there a lot of investments to be done for this?
Yes, you're right. There are the two issues. So there is an IT issue, but I was also mentioning this rationality issue because we saw that some producer that have IT system, I mean they manage, they have the IT to curtail their production, and yet we saw that the period of curtailment didn't correspond to the period of negative prices. So there are of course, two options. Maybe I was a bit blunt to say the rationality was limited. We could say that they have a risk management, so they are very adverse to the risk, so they prefer to curtail before the period and then to produce again after the period. So it's risk management. I'm not completely sure it is that, because we used to have a lot of events of that type at the beginning of the negative prices period, and now we saw it's quite limited. So I think there is a learning curve, and probably they adapt to this. But anyway, at the end, it should be quite limited. This aspect. The real problem we will face is the first point you mentioned, and it is linked to self-consumption, because all the PV that are in self-consumption are not monitored by neither the DSO nor the TSO. And honestly, I think it will remain, because if you are a self-consumer, I can't see the reason why you will install costly IT system to monitor your consumption in link with the prices of the system, because you are a consumer producer. So your only objective is to optimize your consumption, your battery, your PV. So I'm not confident in that. And maybe an illustration, it's not just a prospective perspective. We had information from Australia, because in Australia you have part in which the level of PV is very, very important, and the level of residential PV. And this PV is not monitored. And in some events, there was in these areas, there was too many PV, but as it was impossible, in fact, to curtail only the production, the DSO, the TSO and then the DSO decided to curtail all the area, I mean the consumption and the production, to solve the problem, because it was impossible to just curtail. So we can have this thing which is a bit crazy. We have too much energy, and yet we curtail consumption. So it's not, it really happened in Australia. So I hope that we will not see this kind of event in France, but it's a possibility. It's a real issue. It's not the case today, but in the future, and in Germany, with the level of PV in self-production that is forecast, I think it will be a real issue, and the probability that in some event we curtail an area because we cannot curtail just a PV producer is real. It's a.
Thank you so much. We can maybe have a drink, all of us. Maybe Anna, you want to share a bit of information for the next event, or?
Okay, thanks, Antoine. Yes, so just to remind you all, we have upcoming events in Infravenir, including tomorrow, Conference on Biofuels. On the 3rd of October, Le Grand Paris Express. The 4th is a day-long off-site to Lyon, so don't miss that out. And the 9th of October, Gigafactories, which will be moderated by Sandra also. And all the registrations are already up for those, so please don't miss them. And finally, the 17th of October will be the part 2 of this discussion on negative electricity prices. But this time around, we're going to look at the solutions in place. So there, I think we're good. And
thank you so much for being here. And let's have a drink.
Et voilà, c'est déjà la fin de ce podcast. Merci de votre écoute. Si vous avez aimé, n'hésitez pas à mettre 5 étoiles et le partager autour de vous. Vous pouvez vous renseigner sur les prochains événements d'Infravenir et adhérer à notre association sur infravenir.com. Retrouvez-nous aussi sur notre page LinkedIn Infravenir. À bientôt!